We're pretty much at the limit of borrowing at the moment.
You are supposed to be the servants of the people. The people are supposed to be your bosses. And to me, the people doesn't even realize that.
Good evening. My name is Ralph from St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
I'm going to say something that's controversial. CARICOM has gotten in its own way.
I want to be very clear that there is a dangerous tendency in our country.
This program is talk about the facts. We must bring the facts.
Time to face the facts.
Good evening, viewers, or good morning, or good afternoon, wherever in the world you are watching this program. Welcome to this edition of Time to Face the Facts. I am Beverly Sinclair, your host, and this evening we are going to be looking at good governance. Don't go away, we'll be right back.
No one should live in fear of the person they love, children included.
This is something that is really becoming an issue within our country, and we need to make necessary steps to stop it.
It seems like sexual violence against women and children has become habitual.
Abusers, Mr. Sickle, it ain't macho to get on. So I said no, I said no, I said no, nowhere.
This has been a message from the Ministry of Social Development, Housing and Community Empowerment in collaboration with its social partners. If you or anyone you know is in need of help, please feel free to contact us at 440-2269. And remember, a life free from violence is possible.
Feel good facts.
Remember, if you have flu symptoms, do the right thing and stay at home to avoid giving it to others. Remember, you can be infectious up to a week after developing symptoms, so rest up and take it easy.
Welcome back to Time to Face the Facts. We're going to be looking at good governance, and to help us do that this evening, we have Dr. Patrick Antoine and we have Malika Peters. I will ask each in turn to introduce themselves, tell you a little about their organization and the substantive role they hold and play, and then we will get into our discussion on good governance. As they say, ladies first, so we start with Malika.
Thank you, Beverly. Just a minor correction. It's Malika Parker, not Peters.
Oh.
But I still commend you because usually it's my first name that people are getting confused. All right, so my name is Malika Parker. I am from Antigua and Barbuda. I am a former parliamentarian, and I would have served during the period of the UPP's administration in my country, 2004 to 2014. I had the distinction of being one of the youngest parliamentarians, and I sat in the Senate, also serving as the junior minister of social transformation. But I am here today because I am a part of a handful of individuals who have started a bold new endeavor of a third political party in my country, the Democratic National Alliance. And so I am a founding member of that organization. I'm sure as our show goes on, I'll be able to tell you more about how we came about and what our agenda is.
Sure. Thank you very much. And Dr. Antoine. Dr. Antoine is really no stranger across the region, you know. I think he has a finger in every single country in this region. Am I right, Dr. Antoine?
Yes, for my blessings, I'm a product of our community, our Caribbean community. Indeed, that is the case.
Very much so. So you recently set up or headed a new organization in Grenada. Tell us a little bit about that organization and why you thought it was necessary to get that organization going.
Well, thanks again for inviting us, and I was so happy to accept this invitation on behalf of the Grenada Movement, acronyms TGM, as it's come to be referred to both at home in Grenada and across the region and in the diaspora. The Grenada Movement, or TGM, was established on the principles that we needed to have in a constitutional democracy such as ours, or people being in a position to participate fully in decision making, to participate fully in the socio-economic developments in our country, whether they were part of the majority ruling party or part of the minority that in our constitutional system of democracy does not hold or did not hold a seat in our parliament. And so coming from that standpoint that we all needed to be involved, particularly at this time, but recognizing too that Grenada has had, as George Brizan says, as the island of conflict, we've had a tradition of not having ever had the full involvement of our people in development because our politics has become increasingly tribal, that there needed to be a force that could bring all parties together, not just from the political divide, but also persons who typically did not participate in the political process, from civil society organizations, from churches, from sports groups and clubs, from community organizations, from the business community, youth, persons who were not so young and persons who were elderly. We felt that there was a platform, the need for an organization that could weld all of these together, really for the common good, and that common good being, of course, the development of our country. And all of this, of course, is undergirded by our constitution. And so as we go through the program, we'll touch both about how does a group like TGM become an important force between government and the governed. Between government as we know it and the governed, the people, we see ourselves playing an important role there at this time.
Very good. And I have to let the viewers know that we are also expecting Joshua Francis from Dominica to join us. He is also part of a group that was put together to put some pressure on the government to stay on the path of good governance. So as soon as he is able to, Mr. Francis will join us. Now, Maleka, you were part of government. You served as a junior minister in the parliament. You were part of another political organization, but then something happened and a group of you decided that what was happening was probably not giving you the results that you wanted. What drove the formation of this new party? And do you think in our kind of system where the two-party syndrome seems unbreakable, do you think that you will make some kind of dent in Antigua in the political landscape?
Right. And those two questions alone, Beverly, could be the entire program. But I will start with the first one. Anyone that is in tune with the Caribbean landscape, and particularly Antigua, would know that we had the distinction of being governed by one political party for well over 50 years of our political existence. In the last instance, it was an unbroken 28 years of governance by the Antigua Labour Party. And so when my form a political organization, got into government, a lot of people saw that it was a revolutionary movement, to be honest. And persons saw the opportunity to bridge that gap between the governed and the governing, right? But I must say that our 10 years in government did not deliver that type of political transformation that I believe the masses craved for at the time. I like to look back at that era as being a moment of our history that I think was a squandered opportunity to change our political dynamic. And I say that boldly, having been a part of that administration, although I did not sit in cabinet, right? I was a senator. So what happened is after we lost power in 2014, we lost government, I should say, in 2014, a group of us in our political party decided that we were going to challenge for the leadership of the party. We ran on a platform of change, that the party needed rebranding, that we had strayed from our ideological thrust. You know, we were supposed to be a party of people's first, and what we saw was a lot of the mimicking of the bad, poor governance, corrupt habits that we would have accused our predecessors of. And there was this fraction of the party that desperately wanted us to get back on that ideological path, that people-centric focus, you know, that revolutionary idea of what governance could look like. And to top it all off, we were putting forward, for the first time in any political party, a female leader, challenging for the head of our political organization. And that is where the last crumbs would have fell from the table. As you can imagine, you know, we were a militant fraction within the organization. And so I can speak to my own experience where I would have voted against my own party in the Senate on key policy that I felt did not really reflect what we were supposed to be about. So in other words, I was already in the bad book. So when our leader decided that he was not going forward, a group of us pushed hard to get a change. And that caused a serious break in the organization. And if we're speaking about democracy, I suppose at some point we can speak about party internal democracy, because it is quite frankly there that this whole culture of hypocrisy and dualism and, you know, all of these things, nepotism and everything, it is within the walls of political organizations that those things are concretized and germinated. And so we went up against the establishment. And as the history is, I believe, with any group of people going up against the establishment in political organizations, we got a brutal beating. But not in the sense that we lost. In fact, we withdrew from the election at last minute, and we decided that we were not going to justify. And so we withdrew. And we said, our party, if you want to have a coronation and just, you know, make whoever you want to make leader, then do that. But we were not going to give that the seal of any just process. And so it is that core group that eventually formed a new political organization. And we did so. None of us are political neophytes. Despite my age, I came from a political family. I was going to political meetings from a young age. I am the first female president of the largest trade union here. And as we know, our trade unions in the region are aligned in some way to political organizations. So I am not a novice. I knew what the odds were. And I know that generally we are expected to toe the line. But we decided that we were going to be bold, we were going to stay true to our values, and we were going to push the envelope. And we formed this organization 4 years ago with the female Joanne Messiah, who we would have been offering as leader of the UPP. She is currently the leader of the Democratic National Alliance. We faced the first election 2 years ago when our government here called a snap election. In that election, the party fielded 12 out of 17 possible candidates. That in itself is a victory. But I can say, and I endorse wholeheartedly, your statement that third parties in general are not given favorable odds in our political landscape. But we in the DNA have said that we are realigning the idea of success, that we're not just in it to win the election, but we are in it to change the conversation, to push an ideas-driven developmental agenda. And so we would have been the only political party, smallest, newest, that would have laid out I think a 20-year vision for the development of Antigua and Barbuda. That we are saying to our people that we do not have to be caught in the cyclical electoral 5-year cycles of development, which have been counterintuitive to our development in small countries. So one of the core principles that we push is a long-term developmental plan, right? And so I can say that so far, we are seeing that even the more established political organizations have began to mimic some of the things that we're saying in the public. We have been able to garner a lot of support for these ideas. We speak about decentralizing the seat of power. We talk about constitutional reform. We talk about electoral reform, right? And these are things that really the majority of the people want. But, you know, political parties, no matter what side, seem to forget once we get into power. So I will leave that there for now, but accept that it is difficult, that winning an election is really a high bar. And if you go into it with that singular agenda, you can get hit off that mark quite easily and dissuaded quite easily. But I'm happy to say that we're trying just to change the political landscape, to change the conversation, to move away from a personalities-driven politics to a more ideas-driven type of politics and governance. You know, and in that way, we are happy with our small successes. Although we accuse the two political organizations of stealing our ideas from time to time, right? We're talking about how we can diversify our economy, and then 2 months later, you'll hear the government espousing the same thing. And we say, go ahead, take it. If it's going to be that, you know, our developmental trajectory changes, then fine. We're happy to supply the ideas and you implement them.
You have put some very interesting points on the table. Personally, what some of the things you mentioned about the structure and democracy or lack of within political parties is one of the reasons why I usually advocate for the end of political parties and that kind of structure. Dr. Antoine Patrick, did Malika say anything that sounds familiar to you?
Yeah, in fact, I smiled all the way through because I think she's made a number of the points that we have held near and dear in introducing TGM to the population and to the community in Grenada. Just to say that to augment what she said, we believe fundamentally that power, political power, and the ability to govern really comes from the will of the people. And we believe that the will of the people means all the people, and it's not theoretical. We believe that when we start looking at things such as the will of the people, then we need to start asking ourselves, well, how do we get our people to a point where they are able to make wise political decisions about who will lead them, and how do they participate properly so in the electoral process. And I think a second thing for us is when we talk about this notion of democracy that derives from the will of the people, I think there is a presumption. Eric Williams, I think, said it best in 1962 in his address leading up to independence in Trinidad and Tobago. I think when we look at the will of the people, we're talking about really how can the people become the watchdogs for this process that we call parliamentary democracy, and what comes from it, and what role would our people need to play if they are to be watchdogs. And I think this is where in our system we see that we don't have a lot of opportunities outside the political process in terms of party politics now, very narrowly defined, for civil society and other groups to really have an effective voice in the process. Yes, many times they're consulted, and that's been the sort of that's been the concession, if you wish, made in the last 10 years in many countries. But really, to be effectively consulted, to have their voice take on meaning when they put options, I think you will find that in many countries, certainly in ours, people are arguing and advancing, rightly so, that there is really no evidence that what they said, what they've contributed makes any difference. And I think that is running into a process of frustrating even the small window afforded to civil society organizations and NGO groups. Because ultimately, after 2 or 3 cycles, people then start taking the position, well, my participation is not going to make a difference anyway, so that we go right back, as it were, to naught, without, again, having any very effective participation in the process. And I think also important for me is how do we educate our people so that they understand, right, what the public issues are, so that they understand, for instance, what their roles are in the civic life of the nation. Those are important things for me as you look at the way in which I think our society has evolved. And also, it's very important for us to recognize that in our system, when we start looking at the model, the issue of first past the post, it means that even if a party gets 40% of the popular vote, it is quite possible, as we've seen, certainly in Grenada, but this will happen over and over again in a lot of countries. They don't have a seat in parliament. And so if we allow this model to perpetuate, what we're likely to see is that increasingly a large percentage of our population on any given issue are not going to have their voices heard, even if those voices are minority voices that can find accommodation within the context of government policy. And so for me, I think there are certainly about 5 or 6 things that I think which are important for us at this time. I think for me, one is the real, very serious. Yes.
I'm going to ask you to hold on those 6 things. We're going to take a short break. And when we get back, we will certainly pick up this conversation right there on the 6 things that are important to the Grenada movement at this time. And I want to drill down a little bit deeper into some things you said, especially about the people getting to the point where they elect on a little bit more than emotion. But don't go away, viewers. This very interesting conversation will be right back after this short break.
With so much information about COVID-19 on the news, children can become overwhelmed and even fearful, especially if they have a medical condition. As a parent, you can help to manage your child's fears and anxiety. Provide your child with the correct information about the virus. Remind them to wash their hands frequently with soap and water and to cover their cough and sneezes with a tissue or into their elbow. Monitor what your child sees about COVID-19, especially on social media, where the information may be misleading. Be aware of your own response. Instead of panicking or appearing anxious, reacting calmly could help to allay your child's fears and anxiety, and they too will model your behavior. Remember, how your child responds is dependent on you.
Landslides happen all the time. Sometimes little, sometimes big. Hazards. Take control. Reduce your loss. You can do something about landslides. Trees and shrubs on hillsides bind earth together and help stop landslides. Preserve vegetation. Stop landslides. Find out more at your local disaster office. A message from the National Disaster Management Agency and SEDERA.
Men are not made to physically abuse women.
It's something that has become a serious problem in our country, or has been a serious problem in our country. Abuse could present itself in many forms. It could be physical, verbal or emotional, and the most egregious, sexual.
It's not a good look. It's not right in no form. So domestic violence against women should stop. How can you hit a woman, beat a woman?
Every form of abuse has an effect on the individual abuse, on their family members, on children, even the community as a whole.
I'm a man. I came out of a woman. I love my mother. I love my nieces. So to the children, if you're being abused, talk to somebody that you trust and get your message to the person.
This has been a message from the Ministry of Social Development, Housing and Community Empowerment in collaboration with its social partners. If you or anyone you know is in need of help, please feel free to contact us at 440-2269. And remember, a life free from violence is possible.
Welcome back. We are on Time to Face the Facts. My name is Beverly Sinclair. We have with us Dr. Patrick Antoine. We have Malika Parker. I'm getting it right this time, Malika Parker. And we expect to be joined by Mr. Joshua Francis in a little while from now. But before we went out, Patrick had said there are 6 things important to the Grenada movement and to him as someone who is seeking to make a change on the political landscape. So we go right back to Patrick to tell us about those 6 things. And right after that, I have a little clip from Lee Kuan Yew that I want to share with you and with our viewers to look at what he had to say about governance and governing and selecting people to lead. So go ahead, Patrick.
Fantastic. So for us, I think there are 6 things that we have aligned around as being particularly important for the NGO movement, for pressure groups at this time, particularly in democracies like ours, where our system does not admit easily the participation by all of the community, particularly the segments of the community that exist outside of the corridors of parliament in terms of political power and influence. And the first one for me is, how do we keep governments responsible to the community? Very, very simply, right? What is expected of us in this construct of democracy, given our constitution, to keep governments, right, true to the mandates in terms of what they must do for the country? What is this responsibility that we're talking about, and how do we keep them responsible to the community for the actions, for the decisions, for the policies, etc.? The second one for us is, very importantly, finding space for the NGOs and certainly groupings like ours to express the minority view in the community. There is a tremendous tendency now, I have found, in many countries, for governments to, even without respecting the normal procedures and protocols that attend to the submission of documents, even where there are minority groups in parliament, the government essentially bulldozes legislation through. The government often does not consult. And where it does, it already has a very clear sense of what the mandate is that they want to receive, so that the consultations really are only for formality. They are really not as substantive. So expressing the minority view in the community is important. And let me say that that is deeply embedded in our notion of constitutional democracy. Thirdly,
before you go on to the third one, Patrick, we are being joined right now by Mr. Francis. So we welcome him as he joins this conversation. So go ahead, Mr. Francis, welcome. We have Malika Parker, we have Dr. Patrick Antoine. We are looking at good governance and what ordinary citizens can do to keep governments accountable. So Patrick was just explaining some things, 6 things that are important to his group, the Grenada Movement, as far as changing the landscape and getting people to think different goals in this kind of political system that we have in the Caribbean. So welcome, Mr. Francis. Patrick, please continue with the third one.
Joshua, welcome. So we were already talking about 6 important principles. Thank you so much. That we see as being very important to TGM in the context of Grenada, but I'm sure it applies elsewhere. The first one we said was keeping government responsible to the community. The second one we said was how do we express the view of the minority, particularly the minority that exists outside of the corridors of power within Parliament, because they would have lost their representative, they would have lost the constituency. But it is quite possible we established earlier, as we're seeing happening now, to have a system where the government wins all the seats, but where the other party in a 2-party system gets a substantial part of the popular vote, yet still they have no political power. The third thing, monitoring and evaluation. And I was making the point here that most of our countries now have development plans in CARICOM. But the truth is that when you look at these plans, very few of them have any capacity to monitor and evaluate how well we're doing, how far we are from the objectives that we've set. And there is no participation in those monitoring and evaluation frameworks. This is something I'm going to be speaking about elsewhere, so that you can have other groups and other organizations that are non-governmental essentially feed into the monitoring and evaluation of these national development plans, particularly having regard to what Malaka said earlier, which is that they are supporting 10 and 20-year plans. And as accordingly, since you're spanning political cycles, it's going to be particularly important to make sure that these plans are truly national and can benefit from a all-of-society approach at any one point in time, where all of the various groups can align around what the plans are and then how far we are in terms of not achieving the objectives. So we think that's important, and we think that's an important role for NGOs such as ours. And the issue of information, information. So often now, we find that governments do not feel that they need to provide the proper information on key issues to the population. So often now, information that ought to be en passant, par for the course, is like pulling teeth. So often now, when you press governments for information, you get 5 or 6 different explanations on simple matters. So often now, we hear when questions are asked, government saying, it is not your business. And in our countries, somehow, countries that have come out of independence, countries that struggled to come out of a post-colonial era, somehow our societies have grown this collective silence. When governments say to you that your business is business that really are only for their account, that only they must be the custodians of information critical to the functioning of our constitutional democracies. I find that appalling. So that's the fourth rule. Fifthly, the question of alternative advice. In very few places, and I can see that there are a few, where governments admit to advice from others outside their political parties and outside the corridors of influence, particularly from NGOs. But too often, even where you have good advice, 2 problems. The NGOs and the political parties that exist outside, and I've used political parties here as well, believe that the advice is not going to be heeded, so they don't give it. That's one problem. The second problem is where the governments essentially have a iron curtain around their processes, and they alone must be the purveyor of all knowledge and all wisdom, and anyone outside of that, right, really does not have a fighting chance of getting even great ideas in. Never mind so many of our governments have educated people who understand that innovation does not come from groupthink, that it comes oftentimes from one person daring to step outside the box and see the world differently. So we have a contradiction in terms of what our processes ought to say, what drives developing countries in terms of innovation and technological growth, and seeing the world differently, and the governance system as we practice it that says, look now, if you're outside because your ideas will contend with mine. And it's going to look as though you're the ones really driving government. And I think sixthly, the issue of how do we allow people who would feel that they have no place, the word is place, in political participation, because they're either not from the yellow party in the case of Grenada or the green party. How do we give them a sense that yes, you can participate in the political process, even though you're not completely aligned to the yellow party, or you're not completely aligned to the green party? And the truth is that for many persons, if you gave them an opportunity, a real opportunity through another force, whether that force is from a pressure group such as ours, or over time from a third political party, you realize that the majority of our people really don't have these entrenched views, either yellow or green. A lot of our people really are centrist in terms of what they want. At the core, our people believe in the same thing. But we've allowed the political system, with self-interest of those who manipulate it, to drive us into political corner solutions. So you either green, and then of course the next step, which I'm seeing in some countries, is that you're then taught to suspect the next man because he doesn't share your idea or he doesn't wear your color. And then the next step beyond that is that you're then taught to hate him. And then the next step is that you're then taught to disenfranchise him. I want to be very clear that there is a dangerous tendency in our countries where, for instance, you have people on political platforms, in government information systems, talking about others that don't share their views, right? In terms which sounds very much like the terms used in Rwanda, like cockroach. I will say no more on this matter, but it's a matter I'm prepared to support. And these are the kinds of things you have, so that what we have is this tribalism. And this tribalism cannot act well for countries with 100,000 people. In the case of Antigua, countries with 78, 80,000 people. In the case of Dominica, on a good day, with 70, 75,000 people. Listen, my friends, there are universities with 100 and something thousand people. I make the point all the time that University of Florida, on a football Saturday, on a game day Saturday, in the swamp, as we call it, that's the stadium in Gainesville, you have 90-something thousand people, Joshua, on a Saturday looking at football. That's more than the population of our countries. Yet still, we are taught to suspect, we are taught to disenfranchise, and more than that, we then say that as sovereign states, somehow, we expect to be pulling forward with half of the population or 60% of the population going in one direction when they suspect the other 30 or 40% of the population and are taught to disenfranchise them. Where we are now in these countries is dangerous. My final point.
Yes, and Joshua, we're going to ask you to introduce yourself and your group, the group that has recently been formed in Dominica, and just tell us why it was necessary, or why you guys thought it was necessary to put that group together.
Well, thank you for allowing me on this platform. As noted, my name is Joshua Francis. A former elected member of Parliament in Dominica. I am also the former deputy leader of the United Workers' Party. I just resigned sometime in January of 2020. I am an attorney at law, having been practicing for the past 8 years. I have my own practice, Joshua Francis Chambers, and I continue to be a member of the United Workers' Party, but after much discouragement, some of them, Dr. Patrick Antoine, And I hope I get the opportunity to speak to some of the issues that he raised, because he did raise some fundamental issues which ordinary people are not paying attention to. Currently, I am a member of a group called CCL. It's a pressure group which was formed last year. It is formed primarily on the efforts of lawyers. A few of us decided to come together as a pressure group, basically to review the legal framework in Dominica and to speak to them, and where applicable to move the court. So for example, in Dominica, there is a hot button issue concerning the accountability of monies derived from the CBI program, that is Citizenship by Investment Program, where the government has allowed monies which are supposed to go to the consolidated fund to go under exclusive control of an individual from the Middle East in partnership with the government of Dominica, whereby he allegedly provides public housing, and in return he's given a certain number of citizenships to sell, and the proceeds are not accounted for, nor there's any oversight in Parliament or any governance body in Dominica. So that is something that my group is inspired to look at. We have gathered information, and hopefully we'll be moving the court in a few weeks. The main reason why we put that group together basically was to help the opposition. And when we speak of the opposition, we're not only talking about the United Workers' Party or the political opposition, but any and every group which is asking for more transparency and accountability in the governance of Dominica. We also have a charity arm. It's not just about intellectualization and litigation, but we see the need to assist NGOs in improving the quality of life, in the eradication of poverty. We have sponsored a couple of high school students, and we're hoping that we'll continue sponsoring them up to university level. We are also involved in the dissemination of information, and in that respect, we have a radio program where every Tuesday or bi-weekly, we speak to a certain legal issue. So for example, over the past few weeks, we have been focused on family law and probate, to name a few.
That sounds very interesting, and that's quite a mouthful there. But I'm going to share with you this clip, which talks about electing people into government and what we should do and what we should look for. A very interesting statement, I think, from the former president of Taiwan there.
And I am dead serious when I said on the eve of National Day, get our ablest and our best into politics. One key requirement is let's avoid hypocrisy and let's do this thing honestly, approximate the market rate. Try and get the government on the cheap, you end up with a cheap government, and you'll be sorry for yourselves. First job of a government is to equalize opportunities, right? Not equalize results. You equalize results, you are done for. You end up with what Deng Xiaoping calls the iron rice bowl. Nobody works, everybody does its minimum, very little rice in the bowl. What made the difference in Singapore was that a group of men in 1963, 64, 65, when we were in Malaysia, we decided that we are going to live only one life. If we have to die, we will die for a cause. That made Singapore possible. We couldn't be placated and settle for less. To settle personally for a way out for yourself was easy. You vote in jokers, cranks, weak men, charlatans with some gift of the gab. You run a very serious risk of losing everything you have. Your future really depends on what you make of it. The government can give you that framework, can give expression to the will of a people, but the people must have their will. If you don't have it, there's nothing a government can do.
Yes, did you all hear that? And I want to get your feedback.
Absolutely.
Yes, because in our systems of democracy, and we keep talking about majority rule, but I can tell you all that is not something that I subscribe to. As far as I'm concerned, it is the minority which rules. When you look at the population of say, Grenada, for ease of reference, let's say 100,000 people. You have 70,000 on the voters list. You have 30,000 that vote for the party which ends up forming the government. So 70% of the population did not support that party. But by virtue of how the voting system is set up on the first past the post, that is the party which forms the government. And that to me is why what we call democracy is so skewed. Because at the end of the day, it is the minority which rules. You have 15 people who sit in cabinet and make decisions for the entire country. Patrick talked earlier about consultation. Consultations, for the most part, are really a farce. They come to you with something already prepared and pretend to be consulting, and the views of the majority now never get included because it is the minority that rules. But based on what we just heard from Lee Kuan Yew about the will of the people, if the people don't have the will, there is nothing that a government can do. And also that we tend to elect, those with the gift of gab. Those are the words he used. I want to hear your reactions, and I'll probably go with Malika first on this one. I want to hear your reaction to what he has put forward, to how ordinary citizens can do something to improve the type of governance in our country.
Well, coming back to that quote from Lee Kuan Yew, what he said, and I put that in context, is something that we Caribbean people don't like to discuss. What he said is that if you go for a cheap government, you will pay a very high price.
That's right.
He also said that you need to get the best and the brightest into government. He said those two things back to back for a reason. Because our political framework, I don't know, I cannot speak for the salary scales and the incentive packages, the legitimate incentive packages of parliamentarians in other countries. But comparatively, our politicians or parliamentarians are paid very low. The salary is not an attractive salary. That is just the reality. And I have come to appreciate that it is in fact designed that way for a reason, for the very dangers that Lee Kuan Yew is warning us about. So that is the first issue. How do you attract the best and the brightest into government when the compensation packages of reality, I mean, we have to deal with bread and butter issues at every level, are not attractive? And then when we couple that with the fact that who serve in public office are usually having to sacrifice a lot of time and other things, reputational and other damage because of the political tribalization that we face, the conversation becomes that people who are in fact the best and the brightest do not aspire to public office. And that hinges me back on Dr. Antoine's group. Because here you have persons who I am judging from the caliber of the doctor here, who are competent, who have sound ideas, who have the capacity to govern. And quite often, they opt out of the political process. I am happy that they have such a political pressure group in Grenada. I can tell you in my country, we have none. And so our social activism footwork, our political activism footprint here is very small, Beverly. And it is small for a reason, because not only is politics unattractive to the people who are competent and capable, but also the culture of victimization, which the doctor also touched on, is ripe and rampant and goes unfettered, where our politicians can declare that they intend to assassinate you economically in public, right? without having to pay a price for that. So then you have the issue of victimization as well, that are stopping and confining and constraining persons, the population, from holding governments accountable. And political polarization and tribalization, which he also mentioned, is a factor. Because then what you have is our competent and capable, in our very small societies where we already have a small human resource pool. We haven't even spoken about the brain drain, of our best and brightest also leaving our region. But then when you also have political polarization and tribalism, where you may have persons who have the capacity and fail to speak up because they are somehow aligned or associated with the ruling class. Okay, our bar association here in my country come in for a lot of scrutiny a lot of the times. They do not have a voice. So even legitimate organizations who should be there providing the population with independent analysis and discussion, it just does not happen because groups feel the need to be quiet, to not offend particularly the ruling class. Then I want to touch on, in response to your question, Beverly, the issue of intellectualization, which Joshua mentioned, versus bread and butter realities of the ordinary people. Sometimes we have to ask ourselves, why are the people, okay, selecting out of the political process? And we know the answer. It is because politics in our region has also become very transactional. And that is the way the society views politics. So even on a minute level, it is about what you can do for me. It has become very individualistic, very personalized, literally door-to-door salesmanship, right? Where there is no collectivism, there is no nationalism, there is no patriotism, right? It is strictly transactional. And so these are conversations that we're having about principles and values and good governance and, corruption and holding governments accountable. I even say to the leadership in my political party, we can't go out there talking about change, right? I'm being realistic because I'm speaking to, seasoned political people here. But even as you want to advance this concept of change and holding public officials accountable and having an anti-corruption mechanism where people where there's more transparency in government, our people, fellow colonists, are actually also afraid of that reality, because it is not just our politicians who are benefiting from this dysfunction of a political system and the corruption. I'm sorry, it is very pervasive, and I can say so, having also served in government. Okay, so what we are faced with, I understand completely what Lee Kuan-yew is advocating, and we all should advocate for that. But the question becomes, how do we reform a society that feels as though it not only has a voice in the process, but quite often has no interest, unfortunately. Okay,
Right.
because after the 5-year cycle, when people in my country, brown paperback pass and people will get paid and people get
That's it.
washing machine.
That's it for another 5 years,
And so on and so forth. They opt out of the process. They opt out.
And I was very happy. I was very happy to hear you mention the Bar Association, because even in Grenada, there are other groups, like a group of young people that have formed themselves together, always calling on the Bar Association in Grenada to particularly defend the Constitution and stand up and speak out whenever they see government abusing and misusing the Constitution. So it's a real thing where the intellectuals in the society, for a large part, will shy away from these public statements because everybody looking for the next contract. Everyone want to be in line to be the next AG. And that is why I am impressed by this group in Dominica, because it's a group of lawyers that came together and say, we are going to take this government to task. They have the legal power to do it. And Joshua, just speak about what kind of impact this has had in Dominica and the difference that it is making on the ground in encouraging the ordinary citizens to say, look, you can have a voice and you can make a difference.
Well, first of all, let me say, when our group was formed, even before we made any public pronouncements, we were already under attack from the incumbent government. They identified our group as a political group, and they aligned us with the political opposition in Dominica, and they tried to put us in a bad light. And the reason, because they may have fear that this group of lawyers will agitate, will advocate for changes, and will defend the Constitution. In that regard, we did not retreat. We understand the political culture in Dominica because the country is so politicized. Once you attempt to speak to any issue of public concerns, somebody, or generally the public, is going to put you in a corner, either in support of the opposition or the government, because the country is so politically divided. And it has been done systematically and probably deliberately by those in governance, because as Ms. Parker has stated, politics has become transactional. The entire political system is now commercialized, and out of fear of reprisals, people choose a side. So our group understands that, and as such, we have come across as being in the middle, a bipartisan group. Basically, we are now working on educating the public, and thus far the feedback has been great. And the reason why we're taking that approach, as opposed to just go headstrong and take a direct dive, is because we fear that if we were to do that, we could be marginalized in short time, because the majority of Dominicans, including persons who supported the opposition, they fear to speak against the government, and they fear to associate themselves with certain groups which are seen as anti-government groups, because they may not get an apartment, because the children may not get a scholarship, they may not get that brown envelope with some money to pay the bill. So our group has decided to go on an educational campaign and to focus on bread and butter issues in respect to matters which touches everybody, like family matters. And thus far the impact has been great. And we have informed the public that we will be challenging the government on certain matters of public concerns. I gave an example of one of them. And the public basically is waiting. They're waiting for us to move the court. Of course, as a group of lawyers, we are very responsible. We do not just want to move the court. We have had to do our research, get our facts straight, and we are almost ready to move the court in respect to the accountability of CBI monies, which we are of the view have been allowed to be diverted into the pockets of persons. Imagine a gentleman comes to Dominica and forms a company, and within 5 years, he's a multimillionaire. And the ordinary person just simply get an apartment, occasionally a child gets a scholarship. And those are the type of realities that we face in Dominica. And it's interesting to hear from Ms. Parker and Dr. Antoine as to what's happening in their respective islands as far as the politics is concerned. Because at one time, we thought Dominica was special, but the impression I'm getting, it's like this is a Caribbean thing right now, where the entire political system has dismantled national identity, it has dismantled patriotism, and it has caused individualism to get to a level where each man is looking for himself. And politics right now is not based on philosophy and ideology. People seem to be driven by what they can get. And unfortunately, the person with the bigger purse is going to be the winner. And until we get electoral reform, as in the case of Dominica, another subject of great concerns for our group, And again, the public is looking for us to be the leaders in that regard, because we have a political system which rests on an archaic electoral system. We have no campaign laws framework in Dominica, when a political party can raise millions of dollars and be able to give individuals $20,000 to get support, where another party has just $1 million to campaign. So for example, in Dominica, it is alleged that in the last election, the Dominican Labour Party government, or the Dominican Labour Party, had something in the region of over $200 million to campaign. And my party just had about 2 million. So you can understand the disparity. And because people have, to some extent, gone into a state of false consciousness and have become passive, the incumbent takes advantage. And if that continues, we're just going to see perpetuity of one party in governance, as what's happening in Dominica right now.
Dominica is not the only country with a party in government for 20 years or more. You know, the same people just get re-elected again and again. And it's for the things we spoke about before. Malika said it, you know, every 5 years, you get a new fridge, you get a new washing machine, you get some galvanizing sheets, you get, you know, some lumber. And every 5 years, it's what, like money Lego time. You know, things just flow and everybody happy. But we're going to take a short break here, and when we get back for the rest of the program, I want to focus on these groups that have been formed. Your group, Patrick, your group, Joshua, your group, Malika. We want to focus on these groups and how you guys can help. What can we do collectively to help educate? And really, because this change has to come from the people. We're all on the same platform here speaking about this change, which is needed and necessary. But as Lee Kuan Yew says, if the people don't have the will, the government can't do anything. So let's take this break, and when we come back, we look at what the ordinary citizens can do to help. And we'll also look at those in the public service, whether or not they are enablers of the dysfunction in the political system. Don't go away, viewers. We'll be right back.
Help prevent cold and flu by washing your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds. That's the time it takes to remove most germs. No soap and water? No worries when you've got alcohol-based hand sanitizer.
I remember when this beach was really wide, a place to picnic and play cricket.
And we used to go up to the end to get away from all the people. Now all the beach gone.
Coastal erosion. When the sea starts to come in and take the land away, everyone loses something.
Granny, look how the waves are washing right under that house.
Coastal erosion. It's a hazard. Hazards. Take control. Reduce your loss. What can you do to help stop coastal erosion? For one, don't drive four-wheel vehicles on seaside dunes. They loosen sand and destroy binding vegetation, causing erosion. Find out more about coastal erosion and other hazards at your local disaster office.
A message from the National Disaster Management Agency and SEDERA.
This has has been a message from the Ministry of Social Development, Housing and Community Empowerment in collaboration with its social partners. If you or anyone you know is in need of help, please feel free to contact us at 440-2269. And remember, a life free from violence is possible.
Welcome back to this edition of Time to Face the Facts. I'm Beverly Sinclair, and I have with me Dr. Patrick Antoine, Malika Parker, and Joshua Francis. And we're looking at good governance. What can the ordinary citizens do to keep governments accountable? Patrick, I think I want to start this off with you. What avenues are there open to the man in the street who may have a problem, who sees that things are not right? What avenues are open? I've heard the hopelessness myself. They say, boy, it don't make sense to complain, it don't make sense to do this. Nothing makes sense because it's like we're under a political system that nobody can manage.
Yeah, so I want to answer your question, but I want to come to perhaps three things I picked up from the Lee Kuan Yew's contribution that I think are important. And I certainly agree with everything that's said, but I want to focus on three things. The first thing to my mind that's so relevant for us and to the answer I'm going to give you is to recognize that we have a systemic problem. It is not a problem only of the entrenched or governing party at this time. We have a systemic problem where even where we've seen changes, and Ms. Parker spoke to it about her sojourn with the previous administration and her disappointment. So we have a systemic problem, and he speaks to this notion of us coming to a place where at a national level we can come to some what I would call decisions that are change variables. The first one I think he's spoken about is how you deal with attracting people and compensating people. When he talks about the market rate, that's a huge problem, particularly in countries such as ours, where there is a perception that, in my mind, has been created falsely, that you can't pay, particularly for talent. And so what happens is that this is the first day I haven't taught at some level since I've been 18 years old. I'm of course just past 25. You can see that, but in a serious way, having taught for nearly 40 years, I can't tell you that my brightest students are anywhere around. Listen to what I just told you, including from Dominica, Brother Francis, including from Antigua. Right? Antigua actually is an exception where I have 2 or 3 of them around. But all of the small islands, our brightest students coming out of the master's programs are not with us. Right? The third issue is that we've allowed a model to be created where those in power essentially give the impression to protect themselves, almost very much like a guild. That somehow, listen, this political thing and the way it comes is subtle. Let me be very pointed, because I haven't thought about it until I listened to the clip. They will tell you, oh, Brother Francis, you can't trust him, Joshua Francis has political ambition. This is a politician telling people who voted for him, and he is in power, that Joshua Francis or Malika Parker, don't trust them because they have political ambition. So then our people who really are not well educated on these matters, in the sense that they don't understand the broadness of it, they start repeating it to each other. So anything Brother Francis says is because he has political ambition. And so intellectuals and people who ought to know better start telling you that, they don't want to participate in frontline politics. And they wear that now as a badge of honor. I repeat, we have a problem, right? So a badge of honor is that the decisions that are made at the national level that impacts you and your family, you don't really want to get involved in that, because somehow, yes, you are more pious than the Pope. You see, it links that way. And so we have that problem which Lee Kuan Yew warns about when he talks about their commitment, that they said, listen, no, we're going to build this thing. There is no option. We don't have that because of what I just said. I think the third thing very quickly is he talks about ideas, which is where, of course, if you pay for it, you get ideas. But for me, the most profound thing is where he talks about rice in the bowl. And in the case of Singapore, what they've been able to do over time is that they've been able to grow the volume, the amount of rice in the bowl, because they took those other decisions. In our countries, we're not taking the decisions. And because we have a systemic problem, and it's gotten worse. So what happens is that the rice in the bowl, right, even where it grows, but it is redistributed in a particular way. And unfortunately, at this time, it's not growing, it's shrinking. So the volume of rice in the bowl is shrinking, right? But the needs of those who must eat from that bowl, right, that's growing. So the real question for us in these small countries, and it comes philosophically to what I think Malaka said, is who gets the rice that's in the bowl? That's really the issue. It's not growing, so who gets it? And of course, we could have another program on that, but I think the second issue then becomes, what does a citizen need to do to get rice? To get their share of rice in a context where there is this tendency towards concentration, where some get more and some get less. And then we have young people without the options of doing other things who feel that in order to get a share of this rice, what must I do? And so we have that problem, right? Which is a systemic problem, but it's become more entrenched recently because there's more contestability. And our economy is because we haven't taken Lee Kuan Yew's philosophy on board. Unfortunately, unlike Singapore, isn't growing, but it's actually very much stagnated and in many instances declining. And so what we have is we have the signs of a massive problem. And I just wanted to say that quickly. What voice do we get in our own democracies? To my mind, we do not have the avenues to participate effectively in that process. Let me say that even in the case of Grenada, where there is a social partners network, again, I plead some non-ownership for some of the information that I've received, because I'm not in fact the custodian, but I have been told, reliably so, that the social partners' participation, right, oftentimes does not result in many of their contributions being fully taken on board, and in some instances being taken on board at all. So in Grenada, I've heard all sorts of contending views, but I've spoken to at least 5 different social partners. And they have told me that, for instance, the National Development Plan in Grenada, they made a number of submissions in the end, and those submissions were not taken on board. So that really, they are disavowing ownership for it. Yet still we champion it and we trump it, right? And it is in fact a system where the government does have all the seats. So it's past it. But what does that mean really? And let me just address the point you made about the issue of our majority rule. You know, in the system that we have of constitutional democracy, which of course has a long tradition, you know, the effectiveness of this constitutional democracy really depends on our ability not to protect the strong, but to protect the rights of the weak. I submit to you that in a system where the rights of the weak are trumped because you're not in parliament, because you're not in the key positions, where those rights, not just who will make the law, but who will enforce it, where those things essentially are shunned aside, right? That we do not have a well-functioning constitutional democracy in many of those instances. And to my mind, I think that is something that we really need to take on board, because ultimately power comes from all the people. And what we have at any one point in time where that happens is that not all the people are participating in the process. So I think what we need to do is to create avenues for NGOs and avenues for social partners to really effectively participate in the process. And to my mind, that may take some change in the constitution, and it may take some change too in the architecture of governance, so that we have a seat at the table. And really, there's a lot more that can be said on this, but we have other colleagues on the platform. I just wanted to say that to my mind, yes, we now have these organizations being formed. Great, that's the first step. But the second step is that there's limited openings for them to effectively engage the process, and we need now to push and these opportunities for engagement more so than before.
Malika, I want to hear your views on this. But earlier, Patrick, you mentioned the attacks and the tribalism and even the assassination on public platforms, even those that tend to say they are government platforms. You have these political attacks where opposing views are alienated and demonized. And the sharks, what I call the minions and the cabals, they go after these people with the support of those at the helm or in positions of leadership. So they think it's okay.
Yeah.
So I really want to bring the question around to our public servants and people in public office. Are they enablers of a dysfunctional system? Malika, what would you say?
You would like me to answer that question?
Definitely.
They are. I'm a straight talker. So they are enablers, but I say that even with a great amount of pity for a lot of them because of the position they are being placed in. And this word victimization is a real word. So they are enablers in the sense that they do not even have the sort of autonomy that they ought to have in those positions in and of themselves, because our public service is really being micromanaged and is just an extension of the political party that is in office. And I say political party and not necessarily political government or administration. I want you to make the distinction. Because what you have happening within our ministries and so on is that people who are aligned to the political parties, you know how it works. That when your administration gets in government, you start this meteoric climb within the public service. Then in Antigua, we have a situation, we have a dual operating political service where you have workers that are appointed by the Public Service Commission, which we call established workers, and then you have non-established workers that ministers of government appoint, which is really to circumvent the sort of independence, individuality, and accountability framework of the public service itself. So Dr. Antoine said it right. The problem is systemic. And so our public servants become enablers because they have been emasculated. They're not able to function in the way that they ought to function. We are being governed strictly politically and not with technical analysis and input to a great extent. So they are not allowed to function. And they keep quiet because they want to keep their jobs. They keep quiet because in my country, we still have a legislative framework which says that public servants cannot contest for electoral office. And again, you can put that down as one of the programs that we can discuss in terms of, is that a good or bad thing? Because the whole concept of having a public service that is independent has gone out of the window. When you have ministers of government handpicking, creating a parallel public service within the public service that they alone hire and they alone can fire, right? And quite often what happens as well is those persons who come on as non-established workers are paid at a higher salary. So you have our public servants being enablers because as well they're not empowered financially or otherwise. And so they just stand still in the ditch and watch the wagon roll by. And then there are some who are able to benefit from that dysfunction. And I'm speaking about corruptly, right? Because the weak accountability frameworks extend from the highest level straight down through our public service. So you have ministries, people who are directors of boards and quasi-organizations who are runaway trains, for lack of a better word, right? So the short answer is yes. But just to tag on what Dr. Antoine said in terms of how do we keep our governments accountable and the need for social activism and for independent voices and for opportunities for engagement. I think that is where a lot of the rubrics lies, because I agree, if people felt that there were these mechanisms that they can be a part of, right, and not be victimized, not have their political history questioned and dissected, or even their personal lives dissected, then perhaps they would opt into those sorts of frameworks. What I know is that my group took the conscious decision to become a political organization. We could be a pressure group, we could have been a think tank that is just putting out ideas. But what we have noticed culturally as well, panelists, is that for some reason, our people only seem to give an ear and credence to politicians, even whilst disavowing, the very politicians themselves. Okay, unfortunately. So we have become so tribalistic, and so that we cannot associate with an idea or a set of thoughts or to become active unless you are politically aligned, unfortunately. As a third party, though, we are hoping that because we are not so aligned to any political organization, that we have people who are competent. We like our party, for instance, have more young professionals that would have run in the last election than the existing political parties. Because as we know, the demographics of our country are changing. In my country, I know in the next general election, our youth demographic will be the largest voting bloc. And our millennials who are demanding something different are not particularly enticed by the current political system. And so offering them a third option, we thought was an attractive prospect. Although we also appreciate that the climb would be long and the journey would be hard. The other issue is the protection that is offered to whistleblowers within the very public service themselves. So in Antigua, we have what we term a trilogy of legislation, which the government that I was a part of would have passed when we got into office. And this is integrity legislation and anti-corruption legislation and so on. And on paper, we have a framework, we have a legal framework that ought to keep our government officials and public servants accountable. But in practicality, it is not being applied. So we have what we call an integrity commission, where government officials are supposed to declare their assets annually, where this is supposed to be a group that is holding governments accountable. When you see a government minister who was being sued before they got into office and, on the brink of bankruptcy, buying our entire gas station and becoming a millionaire in 5 years, this group is not even moved to act. Why? Because the government in power appoints the members of that board. Right? Right. So it's really farcical. So what we have done is just enough, right? We're able to get the packaging kind of sort of right. Okay. But the real tangible, substantive things, having a piece of legislation with teeth, finding independent thinkers, giving the Integrity Commission the weight to go and sequester documents and financial information and so on, right, on behalf of the people. It's not happening. In fact, you have ministers who don't declare their financial position at all over consecutive years, and that is just allowed to stand. And so one of the things that we have agitated is for stronger whistleblower protection laws, because we do believe that there are public servants who don't wish to be enablers, but if they had protection where they could speak up and speak out, they may. Right? And I think as well that Dr. Antonia touched on the whole issue of access to government information. We have an entire legislation. We have an information person that is appointed to do just that, whose desk you're supposed to be able to call and get whatever government document you wish, but it just does not happen. So all we have done is added another salary, right, to the public purse, where we're paying a person, right, to do nothing, to do exactly what those in power expect to be done, right? And so the question of how can you hold the government accountable if you do not have the basic information to do so? Okay, so unfortunately, Beverly and panelists, I do not have an answer to that question, right? At least not a simple one, because when you are addressing systemic issues and cultural issues, the sort of change and transformation that needs to happen is complex, where we need a type of leadership that is indeed transformational, that is indeed not self-serving, right? And a lot of us speak that way until we get into government, you know. So I will leave Mr. Francis to answer that question for us and give us the anecdotes.
Yeah. And Mr. Francis, as the legal mind, I did intend to ask you if you think constitutional change and constitutional reform coming from an angle where people are actually educated about the Constitution enough. And we speak in general terms because, you know, we may never reach everyone. But coming from that perspective or coming along that road where people are educated and enlightened about the Constitution and how it should work, do you think we, by constitutional reform, that we could effect some of the changes that we would like to see in our societies?
Yeah, thank you. And yes, we do need constitutional reform. However, we have to look at it from two folds, because the question is who is going to request for that constitutional reform. As it is right now, most Commonwealth Caribbean countries have constitutions which gives a prime minister almost absolute power. So for example, the appointments of commissioners, how would you expect an integrity public commission to act in the interest of the public when the appointees are appointees of the prime minister? They basically go in the different commissions to act in the interest, not of the country first, but the prime minister who appoints them. We need constitutional reform to make changes to those sort of things, because what it does is it allows the prime minister to politicize all these governance bodies which acts for the prime minister and the incumbent as opposed to the people. So we're not going to get a government to necessarily change those things, because what it will do, it will disadvantage the government. So therefore that change must come from the people. And that is where we have a problem, because the people, and you heard Ms. Parker mention it, we have had demographical changes, we have had cultural changes. It is being said that our Caribbean people are not as deep as they were in the 70s, when you had the civil rights movements in the United States and some other parts of the world. People were more cognizant of their rights, they were more conscionable, they were more inclined to pay attention to matters of public interest. Now, the society has commercialized so much and the political system has changed to the point where individuals are more concerned about what they can get for themselves as opposed to what they can do for the country. And therefore, we have a very serious challenge at hand as to how we can get people to rise and to demand that change. Because the people by themselves are putting up blocks. In my experience as a politician, going on the ground, I would try to speak to individuals and they would say, what do you have? Can you give me a drink? Can you help fix my house? If you do not have that, I do not want to hear you. And that's the reality on the ground. You try to have a conversation like what we're having now at the town hall in certain parts of Dominica, and it's like going on the ocean and trying to get fish with just a little twine. So the question is, how do we get ordinary citizens to pay attention to matters of that nature? And I'm of the view we have to go back to the ground. So as in the case of Ms. Parker, she is a political activist. I'm not too sure what I should say, a politician. She would have to go back on the ground and go one-on-one, two-on-two, and to build a field work of connection or connectivity where she's able to transmit that information to the individuals, and then it will grow. So we have to light a fire under the feet of ordinary or barefoot people, and by dealing with them one-on-one, two-on-one, three-on-one, eventually, over a period of time, you have a movement that will grow. I'm of the view this is not a short-term process. You have to endure in this. Anyone who makes himself available to agitate for change within the political cultural framework in the Caribbean must be willing to work for a long time, because it's not going to happen overnight. If you want it to happen overnight, you have to come with a bigger purse than the incumbent, because that is how it is right now. It's about who has the money. And education amongst our people is going to take some time before you plant the seed and you wait for that to happen over time. So to sum this up, I am of the view that we need constitutional reform. In Dominica, as an example, and I'm sure that's the same for Grenada and Antigua, to get constitutional reform, in some cases where you have the enshrined provisions, you're going to need a referendum. The provisions which require or which speaks to governance of a country require a two-thirds majority in parliament. When you have a country like Dominica and Grenada, where the majority are members of the government, then the opportunity has presented itself for that constitutional reform. In Dominica, we have had a government that has had the majority for the last 3 election cycles. As we speak, we have an 18-3 majority, which means that if the government has the will and a desire to really act in the best interests of Dominicans, it would make some or ask for some constitutional reform. We don't even have that conversation in Dominica. It does not exist. There is no desire to talk about the Constitution because as we speak right now, the Constitution is in favor of the incumbent. So conversations like what we're having now must get to the ground. We must, first of all, get people to listen to us. And secondly, once they start to listen to us, we must speak their language, keep it simple, explain to them, and hopefully we can plant seeds and we can see an elevation of the discourse and then a movement to bring constitutional reform. Because constitutional reform is very important after all. The world has changed, it continues to change. These constitutions were created when we just get independence, and I'm not too sure how many countries in the Commonwealth Caribbean have really made any changes to the constitutions, because we need the reform not just for governance, but let's look at something such as dual citizenship. We're seeing more and more of our brains leaving our shores to go elsewhere seeking opportunities, and some of them want to come back to contribute, but they're coming back as a citizen of the United States, a citizen of Canada. And in some of the constitutions, you are not allowed to run for public office if you hold dual citizenship. So something like that may need to change, because that goes back to the question of attracting the best within the political work. And if our best are trained abroad and they gain citizenship, you are keeping them out because the Constitution says that they cannot participate. So this is just another example of something that needs to change or needs to be reconsidered for constitutional reform.
Thank you very much. And you know what happens on Time to Face the Facts is that we run out of time very, very quickly, especially when the discussion is this gripping and this interesting. You forget the clock. But I'm going to have to give each of you just a very short time, like a minute, to, put on the table in your own words and what you absolutely believe, where we can start. Because I agree with Joshua. It's not an overnight thing. We're not going to get the kind of change we want without educating the people. And we're not talking about getting degrees. We're talking about educating people about their social responsibility and about being a citizen, not being a statistic or just a vote, about being a citizen in your own country. Where do we start? We have these pressure groups, these new political parties that have come on the scene with a different vision. But practically on the ground, Joshua mentioned going 1-on-1, 2-on-2, 3-on-3, and talking to the people. That is a long and a slow process. So parallel to that, panelists, what else can we do to wake up our citizens, to get them involved in what we call our democracy? Democracy is not just the exercise of going to vote. And as Malika said, that has become quite transactional, so it's not even democratic anymore. But what can we do alongside the 1-on-1 and 2-on-2 and 3-on-3 teaching to wake up our citizens and get them involved in a process that can change their lives and the lives of their children and generations to come? I'll start with Malika, then we'll go to Joshua and give Dr. Antoine the last word.
Yes, you can hear me now. Right. As being a founding member of a third political party, we completely disagree with this notion that only two parties can exist in our political space. We throw that out of the window. We know that there is a growing seed of disillusionment amongst our population with the two existing political parties. In fact, we have a saying in Antigua, Sungu no better than Lungu, if you can follow that. So you're not really getting change, you're getting exchange. So we believe that if we are able to interrupt that sort of passing back and forth in the political arena, we're here to interrupt that by putting ideas on the table, to interrupt that in our discourse for constitutional reform, for electoral reform, for decentralization of power, which is really putting more power into the hands of our citizens. So we push a lot for village councils, for example, which we think could be a natural breeding ground for new leaders and for persons on the ground to impact overall government's policy. We also push for diversification of our economic space and the owners of our economy, because we do recognize that the people need to be empowered economically, right? Or else this project does not make sense to them. And so we're seeing that the change has to come from garnering some sort of a third wheel in the political space, where both political parties can see their so-called bases being whittled away. And then perhaps we can have a conversation about what the people really need. I accept that, like Mr. Francis said, that the process is long. And you have to be really committed to that. And you have to be really committed to playing a game where you may be getting no seed, right, for some time. But we are indeed committed to that. So I want to thank the other panelists for sharing their views and ideas. I hope that this is something that we can indeed continue, because this in itself will allow us to do some massaging in our social spaces for these type of ideas across our borders, when we see that our experiences are shared experiences.
Thank you very much, Malika. And Joshua, how are we going to get the word into the minds of our people that constitutional reform is necessary? What is going to happen alongside the one-on-one, two-on-two teaching?
Well, we need to use every possible avenue to disseminate information. So we have to use print media, we have to use social media, radio, and any other form of communication to speak to the mass. We must identify those who are good communicators, those who have the best competence, whether oratory skills or writing skills, to present a package, a message which is simple, one which is palatable, and to disseminate it at any and every area available. Furthermore, we need unity, and that unity must go beyond our geographical borders. So for example, in Dominica, we have several pressure groups, we have several opposition groups. The time is ripe. Just as in Dominica, I would say the same for Antigua and Grenada and any and every other island with political change is a need for all these opposition groups to come together, to surrender party pride and surrender individual pride and ego, and to work together without compromising the identity of the group. Because of course, each group has its own original identity, and we're not asking for the groups to surrender their identities. Rather, what we would like is to see the groups come under one umbrella to rescue those islands, because we are certainly on a bad road. And as Dr. Antoine mentioned earlier, unfortunately, most of us have not seen the destructive path we have taken when a political party can simply buy the mass. What happens over time is that the countries will become more and more shallow, and those politicians who have such a mindset will continue to enrich themselves at the expense of ordinary people. Because when you have millions of dollars coming into a country, the question is, how do you distribute such resources? You have a select few members of the sitting government who enjoy most of the milk, and the majority of the mass basically get handouts. I want to conclude by saying, and I can speak for Dominica, we need electoral reform where you have a voters list which is bigger than the population, a voters list with numbers over 71,000 people in a country with a population with about 70,000 people. Clearly, that is an issue. The voters list is cleaning, and as such, that will come with electoral reform. Where you have a system when an incumbent government and party can have a convention in Antigua, going in the diaspora and holding conventions and paying tickets for supporters to come from various parts of the world to come on the island, even where they are not qualified to vote. That is a problem. Where you have political parties raking in millions of dollars to campaign, and there is nobody to question where that money is coming from, that is a problem, because clearly the donor of such monies must have some kind of influence over the prime ministers and by extension the country. So we are selling our countries, where you have foreign entities coming onto the island and doing work which can be done by locals and having more power and a bigger voice. That is a problem. Where you have ordinary people becoming more and more dependent on politicians, that is a problem. Where you cannot no longer distinguish between the political party in government and the government itself, that is a problem. So for example, in Dominica, a simple example, we have persons with property of the state using like it's theirs. In the past, you had government vehicles, you have a public servant, he would do his work on weekends, he parks the vehicle at some allocated place. Now, you have people using government vehicles going where they want, nobody to question them. So these are just some of the things that we need to speak about. And I'm happy that I was invited on this platform, and I hope it can continue. I want to thank you. I hope to be able to connect with these two distinguished intellectuals. I came here and I felt like a junior, you know, having listened to Dr. Antoine, such a learned man, and then this dynamite Miss Parker, you know. These are just intellectually gifted people, and those are the types of people we need to lead our islands and to lead our country. So I hope I'll be able to, you know, make some connection with them, and hopefully we could work as a team in the region. Thank you so much, Ms. Sinclair.
You are very welcome. And Dr. Antoine, we give you the last word.
Well, I think we've had a really excellent discussion, and I think it's really important that these discussions take place. And look, at the end of the day, I'm finding that in these countries, we need to ask some first order conditions. How can we make our people listen? You know, you can argue that you need to first meet them at their point of need, because a lot of them are vulnerable. I'm starting to look at the demographics of this thing. And as you look at the countries, you're seeing that in many of the countries you're talking about, people, 30-something% of them are actually, you know, below the poverty line. When you go to talk to the 30-something% of these people, the first thing that they rightly need from you, many of them need food. I'm saying this knowing that this message is likely to go across the region. But the truth is that our people have become insecure in many ways. It's not just politically. Our people have become, in many instances, people who miss meals, people who can't afford medical attention, people who can't afford to send their children to school. And so there is a dynamic that we need to work on. I don't have all the answers. In fact, I think we at TGM and others I'm hearing are struggling with how we deal with these genuine developmental challenges that have become larger. The truth is that with the demise of the banana industry and sugar and the traditional products in our country, Lee Kuan Yew's idea that you would bring the best and the brightest in, that you would have innovation that would grow the rice bowl, has not been our experience. So what has happened, unfortunately, unlike the things and the forces that worked for us well, that took us out of poverty, that took us out of being disenfranchised from the political system. It was the economic independence in countries such as Antigua. Having been a teacher of history before, you hear about Bethesda and the rise of the peasantry and the school systems and so on. And these were very proud people who didn't depend on governments. And in the case of Dominica, ditto, up until you know, the 1980s, you had people who were independent and they were not in food insecure and they could take independent positions. And so the question becomes, now that we've transitioned and we don't have the Lee Kuan Yew ideology that has descended on these countries, and what you have is in fact a fight for ever declining resources, or for resources that have not grown in line with the expectation of our population. How do we then, in that context, sustain the principles, the values, and the norms that are expected to sustain a constitutional democracy? And you've touched on some of the issues, Brother Francis, when you talk about you know, the role of money. And so we identify that, look, and it's not a partisan issue. If the governments in power were in opposition, they would hold the same view. And I make this point to colleagues all the time, that what we do today, governments must also understand that when the boom swings, whenever that is, you will have to live with those consequences, and whatever it is that we entrench as practice then becomes the kind of practice that's going to affect you. So we need to get not just campaign reform, but we also need to get the reform of how we finance these campaigns. Absolutely important. And we need to do it in such a way that I think we have independent watchdogs, because our societies have shown, going back to the public servants, that I want to say today, they are passive, if anything, enablers. Many of them are victims. Many of them understand that the consequence of taking a decision in line with principle is that you will lose your job. But worse than that, your wife may lose her job. But worse than that, your children will also not get scholarships. And worse than that, you become essentially, an outcast in the social circles to which you become accustomed. And so many of them decide that I'm not Stephen. I am not going to be stoned by the masses for what? For my faith? By doing the right thing? And you see, it goes right back to the issue of economic, independence. So we need to make our people, to my mind, economically independent again. And in the meantime, what we need to do is that we need to engage them. There is no alternative for engaging our people 2 by 2 and 3 by 3. Brother Francis's point, I think, is very valid. It's not a Dominican thing or a Grenadian thing. It's a Caribbean thing. Our systems emerged. And Malaika, you would know too in the trade union movement because there was engagement, people-to-people engagement. That is how we're going to have to build back these alliances. That's how we're going to have to take back our communities. And unfortunately, social media and all the platforms have become part of that. But it's part of that engagement strategy. And finally, constitutional reform. But there has to be a groundswell for it. And the groundswell will only come from the things I've mentioned. It's not going to come from officialdom. In Grenada, it's been tried twice, if you wish, and twice it's failed because it was politicized. And it was politicized because the theory of the rice bowl that Lee Kuan Yew talks about was in full effect. That because it's become politicized, what must I not do to maintain my share of rice? And once there is no clear answer to that, and the answer to them is that I must essentially plead adherence to one side or the other, regardless of what the issue is. Even if we had it now, we would have the same outcome. So I think what we have is a conundrum. We are in a conundrum. And I think it really is time for minds like us, without prejudice to political parties, to who is in government. Because this thing can swing. To ask ourselves the question, what do we need to do to sustain the principles, values, and norms in a constitutional democracy? And what are the first principles that we need to move to, such as engaging our people, providing for them, and ensuring that there is no victimization in the meantime. And my friends, until then, I think that what we're doing is important, but I think we now need to go the next step. My last point is that TGM is itself faced with the same problems that many of the colleagues face. And TGM, many of its members are engaged in a process now of reflection, because we are in fact being pushed and prodded and shoved into becoming a political force in a party sense, because many believe that there are no options for the manifestations and the incorporation or even taking on board of some of the views that we have. So it's a very dynamic process. We're looking at it carefully, but TGM is finding that the population is pushing it in the way that Ms. Parker and yourself, Brother Francis, would have spoken about, in becoming, as it will, full-fledged political forces for the reasons that the avenues for engagement and participation are simply not there. So thank you so much for having us.
Thanks to each of you for taking the time to participate in this necessary and what turned out to be a vibrant discussion. And it will continue, whether on Time to Face the Facts or in other fora, it will continue. So thank you very much. Thank you, viewers, for tuning into this program. I'm Beverly Sinclair, my guest, Dr. Patrick Antoine, Joshua Francis, Malaika Parker. Thank you. And tune in next time that this program airs. Bye-bye.
Stop the spread of germs that can make you and others sick. Cover your nose and mouth with a tissue when you cough or sneeze. If you don't have a tissue, use your elbow. Wash hands often, especially after coughing or sneezing into a tissue.